Hello, hope you're having a lovely day so far. I'm Abby, an author and computer scientist, and this will be a little bit about how I took my book from first the germ of an idea to this, all as a full-time student in college. At this point, we're about 2.5 years removed from when I first had the idea for The Power of Shadows. So I had to go through all of my old notes, brainstorming, comb through old files to try and kind of piece together the exact dates of the timeline from start to finish writing and publishing the book. I came up with about 4 different sections for the different stages of the writing process. First was planning. This came with brainstorming about the world, especially in the fantasy genre. You have so many questions that you need to answer before you can even kind of start thinking about it. At least that's for me. I know there's a lot of pantsers out there who can just go in blind and answer a lot of things. I am more of a plantser, so I like to have some answers going in, but then I do like to have a little bit of, discovery during the writing process itself. The second section is drafting, so this is heads down at the computer trying to get to that first draft. The third is feedback, so this I also included editing, all of the revisions, but I named it feedback because that was so instrumental in my process. I think, there's only so much editing you can do alone. It really helps to get, a second, third, way more sets of eyes on your work to see how it's received and, what the main points are, what people resonate with most, all of the different components that you're not going to be able to get just by yourself. And finally, the last section is publishing. I could speak for hours and hours and hours on this process, but I'll go through kind of the main points on getting my book out to the world. Quick side note, if this looks like something you'd enjoy, The Power of Shadows is a fast-paced young adult fantasy novel about a princess rescuing her brother from a warring kingdom with reluctant allies to lovers, a fun magic system, and overall a really good blend of romance and fantasy. I'll put all the information down below if you want to read more or get a copy. So, planning. In my sleuthing, I found a note in the Apple Notes app that was, I want to write a book, and it was just 3 random ideas of things that I could potentially do. That was dated at the end of August 2021, and so that's the first record I have of even wanting to do this kind of crazy process. From there, I found a few more things of just really giant lists of brainstorming in notebooks and also in the Notes app of a lot of different things, some which made it into the final version, some which obviously did not. And from what I can remember about this process, I spent a lot of it with other people. And so people like my brother, I would bounce a lot of ideas off of him. He's really good at, asking targeted questions. So if I come up with, say, a transportation system for the fantasy world, he's like, well, would that make sense for the time period? How does that fit in with our government? Especially in things where you're playing with, the dynamic between your government and your fantasy world and how that affects your main character as well as the rest of the society. It's really important to have somebody who can kind of fully flesh out the different things that you might not initially think of. So I'm not quite sure how long the brainstorming process took. I do know that it overlapped with me starting the drafting, but I was at least drafting in the start of July. So now we're at drafting. I did the majority of drafting between July and September of the summer before my junior year of college. I was also doing an internship at the time at a big tech company, and then I finished my first draft, which was about 100,000 words. That translates to about 400 pages, right after classes had began. So in September, classes began at the end of August. So now we're at the most integral part of the process, which is what I'm calling feedback. Feedback consisted of rounds and rounds of getting outside perspective and then implementing changes. Included critique partners, beta readers, and then critique partners again. So initially, after I had my 100K draft, I did a few self-edits, and then I sent it to both my mom and my brother. Now, these people are, obviously close to my life, but they're also good for two different reasons. One, my mom is kind of the ideal reader for the genre, young adult fantasy. She reads a lot of it, so she's familiar with the accepted story structure, what she should expect from it, as well as kind of industry standards for plot beats and subplots, as well as the generic tropes that you see a lot. Additionally, my brother has a slightly different perspective. He doesn't read young adult fantasy quite as much, but he is really familiar with kind of the fantasy world and video game development, things like that. And so he's really good at asking probing questions to further develop out characters, world, and other things. And so I sent the current version of the manuscript to those beta readers around the end of November. And so while I was getting feedback from them, I was still posting on TikTok and building up my audience and trying to learn A, how the algorithm worked, and B, kind of reach my target community for people who read this type of book and would be interested in my story. And so after I got my feedback from my friends, I felt like my story was in a pretty good place, but I would really benefit from a lot more perspectives. So at this point, I posted a video on TikTok asking for beta readers, and the book talk community, incredible. Everyone was so nice at filling out the form and, answering my questions, which I can do a full video about the beta reading process, what questions I asked to, get a good selection of beta readers, as well as what questions I asked them about my manuscript in general. But I did that first round of beta reading with people I did not know, which was really helpful. I think I did 15 to 20. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check that. That was at the end of November. And then luckily the timing worked out while I was waiting on feedback from them, which I asked them kind of what date they could get it back by. So it was coming in on a rolling basis. At that time, I was doing finals for my fall semester. And so I wasn't really thinking about my manuscript, which is perfect for while it's out somewhere to be distracted. And then as I got my feedback in, I started implementing more changes, and I ended up doing some pretty large changes to the story structure, especially in the first 20%. I think that's where, honestly, I struggled the most and grew the most as a writer through this entire process, was in both the first chapter and the whole setup of the story. And so I made some really big changes, and then I thought it would be helpful to get feedback again based on that. And so I reached out to the people who beta read and, asked if anyone was willing to read the new version with, the pretty big overwork that I did. And so mid-January, I sent out the new version to the beta readers for the second time. So this was the point where I started to think about publishing. Now in publishing, there are two main routes: traditional or indie. There's also hybrid, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. And I was doing a lot of research on the pros and cons of both, trying to see which would be best for me. And eventually I decided that I wanted to at least try to go traditional for the first version. And so I started workshopping my query letter. I will say that the query letter was honestly by far the hardest part of this entire process. I don't know how many versions I had in the end, probably upwards of 30, maybe 40. But January was when I really first started thinking about querying. So now getting into publishing, which was by far the longest part of this process. I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts of what I did for the publishing process and, how I got to the final product. If you guys have questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments, and I'll try to make a video as soon as possible. But I will call out just a few important milestones throughout this process. One was I submitted to something called Pitchapalooza, and so that was a contest where you submit your query and people judge it, basically. And so I submitted my query and I won fan favorite. I got the most votes. And so through that, I won a consulting session about my query letter and my first 2 pages, the whole package. And that was super, super helpful. That led me to read this book on writing beginnings, trying to really fine tune my first pages. And throughout the entire querying process, I kept kind of iterating, which I don't know if I'd recommend it, but I was learning so much about first chapter and setting up the story in the right place. And so I was also going through I got more critique partners off of Book Talk, actually, incredible people. And I started changing the first pages and trying to make it more engaging and really fine-tuning my package throughout the entire process. So during my entire spring semester, I'd say, I was working kind of on the querying process, whether it be sending out batch queries or, changing my package, etc. And during the querying process, I also started working on my next book, which is pretty common advice you'll hear to start working on your next project as you're working on it. I think on average, authors write 4 books before they get agented. So a comforting statistic, also a little harrowing. But then we ran into some important life events. So during the querying process, I also was pretty regular on posting on TikTok and was fairly engaged with my audience. And then I graduated college. And so in May of 2022, I graduated and I had the summer off, and then I was starting my first corporate job. I got a job in computer science in my desired field at a big tech company, and I, over the summer, was so drained from college and everything that I wasn't as regular posting on TikTok, and I decided to take a break from the querying process. And so at this point in the story, there is a large time jump between me graduating, then starting my job, getting used to the new city I moved to, all of the different life changes I was going through, and then when I decided to finally publish it. I'd taken this long break, and I decided that I wanted to print a copy just for myself to have. I figured I wrote this book, a lot of people enjoyed it, and I wanted to be able to have it on my shelf. And so I looked into the Barnes & Noble printing. I saw that you could print a book for like $7. So I kind of threw together a cover and did some basic interior formatting, and put it up and ordered myself a copy. And it wasn't the prettiest, but it was really fun to be able to have it in my hands. And this was around the time when I decided, you know what? I am really proud of this book, what it's become, all the editing that's been done to it. It felt polished. And so I decided I wanted to try doing the self-publishing process. So between getting my first initial copy and having it actually out to the world, there were 1,000 steps. It was kind of a whirlwind of different things to do. I did more editing on it, lots of line editing, as well as just, fine tuning. The story was pretty good, but I wanted to make sure that it was polished enough to be out and, to readers I don't know. But really, I just wanted people to be able to order it and be able to read it. And so I could go into that in another video. This one's probably too long as it is. But this didn't end up coming out until the end of October 2023. I might do another video on the main things I learned and mistakes I would avoid in the future, because I did a lot of them and a lot of things that I wouldn't want you to have to go through yourself. But if you have any questions about any part of the process, whether it be the drafting, the feedback, brainstorming, whether it be brainstorming, drafting, feedback, or the publishing process, please drop them below and I'll do my best to answer.